Carly Madison Gregg.
Her fate.
Carly Gregg is evil, and that's not easy to say, but the truth of the matter is sometimes evil comes in young packages.
The quiet streets of rural Mississippi don't usually make national headlines, but in early 2024, one home became the setting of a story that stunned the entire state. Inside a modest house, a 15-year-old girl carried out something most adults could barely bring themselves to imagine: the deliberate slaughter of her own mother. Her name was Carly Madison Gregg, and by the time the case reached trial, her name had become synonymous with a level of teenage rage that left even seasoned investigators shaken. From the outside, the Gregg family looked ordinary: a blended household, a remarried mother trying to raise her daughter while building a life with a new husband. But behind that front door, tension simmered. Relatives later described endless fights between Carly and her mother. Arguments over control, over discipline, over the new stepfather Carly never accepted. What no one could predict was that these clashes would one day erupt into the kind of violence that makes people wonder if evil can grow inside someone so young. The night it happened, the Gregg house was lit like any other. But in Carly's mind, a different kind of illumination was burning. The plan she had nursed, the decision she had already made. In the dark hours, when her mother and stepfather believed they were safe under their own roof, Carly struck. What followed wasn't an accident. It wasn't a split-second loss of control. It was a brutal choice executed with cold determination. Her mother never saw it coming. Carly attacked with lethal force, leaving behind a scene drenched in chaos. When her stepfather rushed to intervene, she turned on him too, determined to finish what she had started. He barely survived the assault. Investigators later said the only reason he was alive to testify was luck. She had intended for both adults to die that night. The crime wasn't quick, and it wasn't clean. It carried the signature of someone who had thought about it long enough to turn fantasy into reality. By the time police arrived, the truth inside that house was undeniable. The woman who had given Carly life was dead. The man who had tried to hold the family together was bleeding and clinging to survival. And the teenager at the center of it all showed no sign of panic. Officers who responded that night said her expression wasn't one of shock or fear or even confusion. It was flat, detached, almost as if she had finally crossed a finish line she'd been racing toward for months. The aftermath of the killing left a community reeling. Neighbors spoke in disbelief, describing Carly as a quiet girl, sometimes moody, but nothing like the monster painted in court. Teachers remembered flashes of defiance, strange drawings in notebooks, signs of anger bubbling under the surface. But no one had sounded alarm strong enough to stop what was coming. It was as if two versions of Carly had been living side by side. The student people thought they knew, and the predator who waited until the perfect night to unleash herself. The trial stripped away whatever illusions remained. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, the evidence, the details that couldn't be denied. They showed how Carly had armed herself, how she had gone after her mother with intent to kill, how she had turned on her stepfather when he tried to resist. Jurors listened to testimony about the stepfather's injuries, about the final moments of Carly's mother, about the girl who had once been loved and protected, becoming her family's executioner. Her defense team tried to argue age, immaturity, the impulsivity of a teenager whose brain wasn't fully formed, but the evidence cut through those arguments like glass.
I put 3 in my mom, and I got 3 more waiting for my stepdad. You think that sounds like an insane person? No.
This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't heat-of-the-moment teenage rebellion. This was murder, planned, carried out, and followed through without hesitation. When the verdict came, it echoed through the courtroom. Guilty. And when sentencing was announced, it sealed Carly Madison Gregg's fate. Life in prison. No chance of release. At just 15 years old, she had condemned herself to spend every day of the rest of her natural life behind concrete and bars. Today, while her peers sit in classrooms learning to drive, dreaming about college or jobs, Carly sits inside a prison cell in Mississippi. The world she will grow old in is not one of Friday night football games or family dinners. It's a world of steel doors, routine head counts, and the weight of a single night she cannot take back. The woman she killed will never see another sunrise. The man she tried to kill will live the rest of his life with scars that go far beyond the physical. And Carly, once just another teenager in a small southern town, will forever be remembered as the 15-year-old who decided that murder was the only answer. 2. Christa Pike.
New at noon now, the only woman on death row in Tennessee is set to be executed late next year.
In the long history of American true crime, few names carry the same weight of dread as Christa Gale Pike. At just 18 years old, she didn't just kill, she tortured, she taunted, she reveled in cruelty so disturbing that jurors later admitted they had nightmares after hearing what she did. Even now, decades later, Pike holds a grim record, the youngest woman in modern U.S. history sentenced to death. Christa wasn't born into comfort. Her childhood was marked by chaos, neglect, and early brushes with drugs. By the time she was a teenager, she had already been shuffled through unstable homes, dropping out of school, and falling into the orbit of older men who fueled her sense of rebellion. She landed at a Job Corps training program in Knoxville, Tennessee, supposed to be a second chance for troubled youth. Instead, it became the breeding ground for something far darker. It was there that Christa met Tatterall Shipp, a young man she quickly latched onto with a fierce obsession. Their relationship was stormy, toxic, and bound together by a fascination with the occult. They weren't just dating, they fed each other's impulses, reinforcing twisted ideas of power, control, and punishment. Soon, another girl at Job Corps would catch their attention in the worst way imaginable. Her name was Colleen Slemmer, just 19 years old. By all accounts, Colleen was trying to make a life for herself, training for a future and making acquaintances along the way. But Christa became convinced, whether through paranoia, jealousy, or pure hatred, that Colleen wanted her boyfriend. In Christa's mind, that was enough to sign a death warrant. And so she began to plan. On a cold January night in 1995, Christa lured Colleen off campus. She promised friendship, offered to smoke marijuana together, and assured her it would just be a walk. What Colleen didn't know was that Christa and Tatterall had already chosen a secluded patch of woodland as the place where her life would end. The ambush began suddenly. Christa's rage exploded, and Colleen was beaten, slashed, and terrorized. What makes this case unforgettable isn't just that Christa killed her, it's the way she seemed to take pleasure in prolonging Colleen's suffering. Witnesses later testified that Christa mocked her, carved into her flesh, and ultimately crushed her skull with a chunk of asphalt. Throughout it all, Christa was in control, savoring each blow as if it wasn't just violence, but entertainment. By the time it was over, Colleen's body was left mutilated in that wooded clearing. Christa didn't stop at murder, she took a piece of Colleen with her. Literally. She cut away part of the victim's skull and carried it back to campus as a trophy, showing it off to others like a prize won in some unholy game. For Christa, it wasn't enough that Colleen was gone. She wanted the world to know who had ended her. The investigation was swift. Word spread quickly about the souvenir Christa flaunted, and soon the police had more than enough to tie her to the killing. Witnesses came forward, recounting how Christa bragged about what she had done, how she described Colleen's final screams, how she seemed almost proud of her handiwork. When confronted, the evidence left little room for denial. Christa had crossed a line that few ever do. She had transformed murder into spectacle. In court, the details shook even hardened professionals. Jurors heard how Colleen begged for her life, how the attack dragged on, how every injury bore the mark of intention. They saw photographs, heard testimony, and listened to Christa's own words boasting about the crime. The defense tried to plead her troubled upbringing, her youth, her instability, but none of it outweighed the sheer savagery of what she had done. When the sentence came down, it was the ultimate one, death. Christa Pike, only 20 years old by then, was ordered to die for her crime. Reporters covering the case noted how the jury didn't deliberate long. The brutality had been too much, the lack of remorse too glaring. Tennessee placed her on death row, where she remains to this day, now middle-aged, her once teenage face hardened by decades of waiting for an execution date that has not yet been set. Over the years, appeals have dragged on. Christa has tried to argue mental illness, inadequate representation, anything that might spare her life. But the facts of the case have remained impenetrable. courts continue to uphold her conviction and sentence, pointing to the overwhelming evidence and the cruel, deliberate nature of the killing. For Colleen's family, the passage of time hasn't dulled the pain. She was 19 years old, with dreams ahead of her, stolen by someone who seemed to find pleasure in extinguishing them. For Christa Pike, the prison cell is both her punishment and her legacy. She is remembered not as a misguided teenager, but as the girl who turned jealousy into torture and made murder into a performance. Decades after that January night, the woods where Colleen took her final breath have grown quiet again. But the echoes of what happened there, the laughter of a teenage killer, the cries of a young woman betrayed, still linger as one of Tennessee's darkest crimes. 3. Alyssa Bustamante.
Is that what happened? Yes.
It started with a notebook. Not the kind filled with doodles and teenage secrets, but one that read like the mind of someone experimenting with evil. In the fall of 2009, investigators would flip through Alyssa Bustamante's private journal and find words that made even veteran detectives pause. They weren't the confessions of an overwhelmed 15-year-old. They were cold, deliberate lines that documented what it felt like to kill. Alyssa's life, from the outside, looked like the story of a teenager finding her way. She lived in the small town of St. Martin's, Missouri, raised by her grandmother after her parents' battles with addiction left them unable to care for her. Friends described her as moody, sometimes withdrawn, with streaks of rebellion. Behind the eyeliner, the sketchbooks, and the fascination with death, there was still a girl who laughed at inside jokes and went to church with her grandmother. But the mask hid something darker, a growing obsession with pain and control. By October 2009, Alyssa had already been digging graves. Literally. In a wooded area not far from her home, she carved out shallow pits in the earth, later telling police she had been preparing them just in case she wanted to kill someone. That detail alone would be haunting. But what made it worse was that one of those pits wasn't left empty for long. Her chosen victim was Elizabeth Olton, a 9-year-old girl who lived just a few doors down. Elizabeth was bright, playful, and innocent, her world filled with sleepovers, toys, and family dinners. On October 21st, she left a friend's house to walk home before dark. It was only a short path through the neighborhood, a trip she had made countless times. She never arrived. Elizabeth's path crossed with Alyssa that evening. Investigators later pieced together the chilling sequence. Alyssa lured the little girl into the woods, far enough that no one could hear her cries. Then came the attack. She strangled Elizabeth until her small body went limp, then stabbed her repeatedly to make sure there was no chance of survival. Finally, she dragged her into one of those pre-dug graves and covered her with earth, as if she were erasing a piece of her own twisted experiment. That moment, the act itself, wasn't born out of rage or revenge. It was carried out because Alyssa wanted to know what it would feel like. In her own words, it was amazing. That was what she wrote in her journal hours later, right next to a casual aside that she had gone to a church dance afterward. To her, killing had been something to check off a list, an experience to savor, and then move on from, as if it were no different than a social event. When Elizabeth didn't come home, her family sounded the alarm immediately. Search teams scoured the neighborhood. Volunteers combed the woods with flashlights. Elizabeth's mother described the night as a nightmare that wouldn't end. But all the while, Alyssa stayed quiet, watching the chaos unfold around her. The investigation turned quickly toward her. People had noticed her odd behavior. Friends whispered about the graves she had dug. When police brought her in for questioning, the cracks showed. Eventually, she led them straight to the shallow grave. Inside lay Elizabeth's small body, her life cut short by a teenager who had killed out of curiosity. Court records later revealed the most haunting evidence: Alyssa's notebook. On the day of the murder, she had written, "I just killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. It was amazing." As soon as you get over the, "oh my god, I can't do this," it's pretty enjoyable. It was one of the most chilling confessions ever written down by hand, the casual tone amplifying the horror. Her trial became a national story. How could a 15-year-old commit a murder so calculated, so detached from emotion? Prosecutors argued that her age didn't lessen the crime. It made it worse. They painted Alyssa as someone who had planned for weeks, fantasized about the act, and carried it out with a coldness that stunned the courtroom. Alyssa's defense team pleaded for mercy, pointing to her unstable upbringing, depression, and self-destructive tendencies. They argued she was still a child herself, one who could be rehabilitated. But the evidence was undeniable, and the words in her diary rang louder than any excuse. In 2012, Alyssa Bustamante pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and armed criminal action. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, along with an additional 30 years for the weapons charge. She was just 18 when the judge handed down the sentence, her teenage years ending inside the walls of a Missouri prison. Elizabeth Olten's family never recovered from the loss. Her mother said every holiday, every birthday was a reminder of what had been stolen. Elizabeth never grew up, never finished school, never had a chance to live out her dreams, all because a teenager down the street wanted to feel what it was like to kill. Today, Alyssa remains incarcerated, serving out a life sentence. Her parole eligibility will come someday, but no matter when that date arrives, the mark of her crime will never fade. She is remembered not just as a teenager who made a terrible choice, but as a girl who planned for death, carried it out, and wrote about it with words that still chill anyone who reads them. 4. Britnee Angelique Miller. On a humid Florida night in June 2010, 19-year-old Audriana Zimmerman thought she was going to spend time with people she trusted. She wasn't walking into the arms of strangers. She was meeting so-called friends. That detail is what makes the story unbearable, because the people she believed wouldn't harm her became the ones who turned the woods into her final resting place. Among them was Britnee Angelique Miller, just 16 years old, whose part in the crime would earn her a life sentence before she was old enough to graduate high school. Britnee wasn't the ringleader. That role belonged to Tina Brown, a woman nearly 3 decades older. But Miller wasn't just an observer, either. She was a willing accomplice in a night of torture that even seasoned detectives later struggled to describe without flinching. For Audriana, the betrayal cut deeper than any weapon. People she thought of as companions had plotted against her, and Britnee was part of the plan from the very beginning. It started with an accusation. Brown and her circle were convinced Audriana had stolen money. Instead of calling police, instead of letting cooler heads prevail, they crafted something darker. They decided she deserved punishment. Not in a courtroom, not with words, but with pain. Miller, still just a teenager, stood by as that decision morphed into a blueprint for murder. When Audriana arrived, the ambush was already set in motion. She was jolted by a stun gun, electricity coursing through her body as she collapsed in terror. They gagged her, bound her, and shoved her into the trunk of a car. Imagine the darkness pressing in, the silence broken only by her muffled attempts to cry for help. The drive to the woods wasn't long, but it must have felt like an eternity, a journey away from safety and into horror. Out in the secluded trees, the real nightmare began. They dragged her out of the trunk, where fists and weapons replaced the restraints. A crowbar slammed against her body, metal colliding with bone. She was beaten until her cries grew weak. But it didn't end there. As if the beating wasn't enough, they poured gasoline across her, the smell of fuel thick in the night air. And then they set her alight. Audriana burned alive, 19 years old, her body consumed by flames while her killers watched. For investigators, the brutality of that act became the centerpiece of the trial. It wasn't just that she had been killed, it was how long she suffered first. Britnee Miller may not have lit the match herself, but testimony placed her there, part of the group that trapped Audriana, gagged her, dragged her into the woods, and took part in the violence. Her age didn't erase her role. It etched her name alongside the others in a crime of deliberate cruelty. When police pieced together the events, the picture was damning. Phone records linked the group. Witnesses recounted conversations about the plot. Forensic evidence tied them to the scene. And then there was Britnee herself. Young, but undeniably complicit. Prosecutors argued she had crossed the line from follower to participant. And the jury agreed. In 2013, 3 years after the killing, Britnee Angelique Miller stood in a Florida courtroom and heard the words that would define her life: sentenced to life in prison. The punishment reflected the severity of her actions. She was only 16 at the time of the murder, but the law held her accountable alongside the adults who orchestrated the attack. The years since have not softened the judgment. Appeals challenged her sentence, with lawyers arguing her youth should allow for a second chance. But in 2017, Florida's courts upheld the life term. While Miller technically remains eligible for review after 15 years, she is still behind bars today at Lowell Correctional Institution, one of Florida's largest women's prisons. For Audriana's family, time hasn't dulled the wound. Their daughter was supposed to celebrate birthdays, finish college, and maybe raise children of her own someday. Instead, she died in agony at the hands of people she trusted. Her mother once said that the hardest part wasn't just losing her daughter, it was knowing her last moments were filled with fear and betrayal. And for Britnee, she entered prison as a teenager and is now growing into adulthood behind walls, her life defined by the night she joined others in turning friendship into a death trap. She will carry that name, child accomplice in one of Florida's most sadistic murders, as long as she lives. The woods where Audriana died are silent now, but the memory of gasoline flames cutting through the darkness remains, a reminder of what happens when loyalty, jealousy, and violence collide, and when even a teenager chooses to join in the destruction of a life that should have stretched far beyond 19. The 5. Brenda Spencer.
How have you grown being in prison?
Well, I've had to kind of grow up and just matured a bit more. And I keep trying to better myself and deal with problems from the past and everything.
The morning of January 29th, 1979, began like any other at Cleveland Elementary School in San Diego. Children were gathering outside, waiting for the doors to open, their backpacks bouncing as they played. Teachers were arriving, chatting as they prepared for another day in the classroom. No one could have guessed that, just across the street, a teenager was preparing to unleash a storm of bullets on the innocent. Her name was Brenda Ann Spencer, 16 years old. She lived directly opposite the school in a small house with her father. From her bedroom window, she had a clear, uninterrupted view of the playground. And on that Monday morning, instead of heading to class like the students across the street, she loaded a .22 caliber rifle and began firing. The first shots tore through the quiet air with terrifying speed. Children screamed, scattering across the pavement. Teachers rushed to shield them, yelling for kids to get down. Within seconds, 2 men, Principal Burton Ragg and custodian Mike Suchar, were gunned down as they tried to protect students. 8 children and a police officer were wounded before the shooting finally came to a halt. But it wasn't the number of victims alone that burned this case into the public memory. It was what Brenda said when asked why she had done it. Over the phone, when reporters pressed for her motive, her response was chilling in its emptiness. "I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day." A throwaway excuse, delivered with eerie calm, transformed her crime into one of the most infamous school shootings in history. Inside her home, investigators later found the setup: spent casings on the floor, the rifle by her side, and a teenager who had turned her boredom into carnage. She had barricaded herself for hours after the attack, refusing to surrender, speaking to negotiators with the same unsettling detachment she would later display in court. To Brenda, the shooting seemed less like a tragedy and more like a grim experiment in attention. The aftermath left a city stunned. Parents wept outside the school, clutching their children, terrified by how close death had come. The community struggled to process how a 16-year-old girl could transform a playground into a killing field for no reason beyond impulse. Teachers, scarred by the images of children bleeding on the asphalt, described scenes that would haunt them for decades. When the case reached court, there was no mystery about who had fired the shots. The only question was why, and whether her youth should save her from the harshest possible punishment. Prosecutors pointed to her own words, her lack of remorse, her casual explanation of wanting to have some fun. They argued she knew exactly what she was doing when she aimed through her window and pulled the trigger. The defense tried to present another side, a girl trapped in a broken home, raised in poverty, neglected by her father, and struggling with depression. Psychiatrists testified about her mental state, pointing to head injuries, suicidal thoughts, and cries for help that had gone unanswered. But in the end, those arguments could not erase the fact that she had deliberately fired into a crowd of children. In 1980, Brenda Spencer pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder and assault with a deadly weapon. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, the maximum punishment available for a juvenile at the time. She was just 18 years old when she entered the California prison system, beginning a sentence that has stretched for decades. Parole hearings came and went, but Brenda was denied again and again. Panels noted her lack of rehabilitation, her failure to take full responsibility, and the lasting impact of her crime. Parents of the victims testified about their continued pain, about the fear that still gripped their families, about the lives that had been permanently scarred by a teenager who once said she was simply bored. As of today, Brenda remains incarcerated, her most recent parole request denied in 2025. Her next chance won't come until 2028. By then, she will have spent nearly half a century behind bars. She has grown older in a cell, while the children she wounded have lived entire lives with the memories of what she stole from them. The phrase she uttered, "I don't like Mondays," has echoed across decades, a cruel shorthand for violence without reason. The schoolyard where she fired those shots has long since healed, the classrooms filled with new generations of children. But the story of Brenda Spencer lingers, a reminder that sometimes the face of horror isn't a hardened criminal. It's a teenager staring out a bedroom window with a gun in her hands. 6. Lorraine Thorpe. In the summer of 2009, the city of Ipswich, England, was already marked by tragedy. Only a few years earlier, the town had endured the horror of a serial killer who preyed on women in its streets. But just when the community thought it had moved past its darkest days, another nightmare unfolded. This time, the killer wasn't a predator lurking in shadows. It was a 15-year-old girl. Her name was Lorraine Thorpe, and by the end of that summer, she would become Britain's youngest female double murderer. Lorraine's childhood was a cocktail of instability and neglect. Raised in a world where violence and dysfunction were the norm, she drifted between homes, often left to fend for herself. At an age when most girls were concerned with exams or friendships, Lorraine was running with older men, hardened drinkers who saw her not as a child, but as a partner in their chaotic lives. The most dangerous of these was Paul Clark, a volatile 41-year-old whose influence on her would prove catastrophic. It began with simmering tension inside Clark's circle. One of his acquaintances, Rosalind Hunt, had fallen out with him over money and personal disputes. The argument escalated into something much darker when Lorraine and Clark decided that Rosalind wasn't just a problem. She was disposable. What happened next shocked detectives for its sheer brutality. Rosalind was lured to Clark's flat, where the violence exploded. She was beaten mercilessly, subjected to an assault so savage that her injuries left a trail of horror across the room. Lorraine, just a teenager, joined in the attack alongside Clark, delivering blows that prosecutors later said showed not only participation but enthusiasm. When it was over, Rosalind lay dead. But Lorraine's descent didn't stop there. Days later, Clark turned his fury toward another target, Lorraine's own father, Desmond Thorpe. He suspected Desmond had betrayed him, and in Clark's world, betrayal demanded blood. This time, Lorraine didn't step aside. She became an accomplice once more, helping to silence her own father in an act that left even the most hardened investigators reeling. Desmond was killed in his flat, his life extinguished not only by Clark's violence, but by the involvement of his own 15-year-old daughter. The brutality of the two murders left Ipswich stunned. The idea of a child participating in such calculated violence forced the public to confront an unsettling truth. Lorraine Thorpe wasn't just a bystander, swept up by an older man's rage. She was an active participant, someone who crossed the line from victim of circumstance to perpetrator of murder. When the arrests came, the story exploded across Britain. Newspapers splashed Lorraine's face on their front pages. The headline, Britain's youngest female double killer, cementing her place in infamy. In the courtroom, jurors heard the grisly details of both murders. They saw photographs of Rosalind's injuries, listened to testimony about the ferocity of the assaults, and weighed the chilling fact that one of the victims was Lorraine's own father. Prosecutors argued that while Clark had been the dominant figure, Lorraine was no passive pawn. She had taken part willingly, knowing full well the consequences of her actions. The defense tried to paint her as a manipulated child, someone too young to resist Clark's control. But the evidence told a different story. 2 victims, 2 deaths, and a teenager whose hands were as blood-stained as any adult's. In 2010, at just 16 years old, Lorraine Thorpe was convicted of both murders and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years. The sentence meant she would spend her entire adolescence and much of her adulthood behind bars, a child turned into a lifer before she had ever sat a final school exam. Her case has remained controversial. Supporters argue she was a product of abuse, groomed by Clark and trapped in a toxic relationship that warped her sense of right and wrong. But parole boards have seen her differently. In 2023, after serving well beyond her minimum tariff, she applied for release. It was denied. Officials concluded she remained too dangerous, still carrying the capacity for violence that had defined her crimes as a teenager. Today, Lorraine Thorpe remains in prison, her name a permanent scar on Britain's criminal history. The girl who once roamed Ipswich's streets is now a grown woman. Her youth spent behind walls, her future forever chained to the decision to join Clark in 2 murders. For the families of Rosalind Hunt and Desmond Thorpe, there is no closure, only the knowledge that their loved ones were taken not by strangers, but by people they knew. For Ipswich, the case was a second wound in a city still healing from violence. And for Britain, Lorraine Thorpe stands as a reminder that sometimes the darkest killers aren't hardened men in their 40s. They're children, barely old enough to drive, who choose to embrace blood instead of innocence. Scarlett Jenkinson.
Scarlett and Eddie, just over 24 hours after they'd killed Brianna.
So you are under caution, so anything you say is getting recorded?
Okay. With me being suspect is because I was last person seen her.
On a cold February afternoon in 2023, a 16-year-old girl named Brianna Gay walked through a park in Warrington, England. It was supposed to be just another stroll, a teenager enjoying a weekend day. What Brianna didn't know was that 2 of her peers had lured her there with a plan as meticulous as it was monstrous. At the heart of it was Scarlett Jenkinson, only 15 years old, whose name would soon dominate headlines as one of Britain's youngest killers in modern history. Scarlett's life didn't fit the picture most would expect of a schoolgirl. Beneath the surface of homework and classrooms, she was cultivating a fascination with violence. Friends later described her obsession with serial killers, her endless research into sadistic crimes, and her cold detachment when speaking about death. On her phone, investigators would later uncover disturbing searches, questions about torture methods, the psychology of murder, and detailed discussions about how to carry out the perfect crime. Together with an accomplice, she began planning something that felt less like teenage rebellion and more like a blueprint for horror. They picked their victim carefully. Brianna was trusting, open, and unsuspecting. She thought she was meeting friends. Instead, she was walking into an ambush, carefully scripted by classmates who saw her not as a peer, but as prey. That February day, the trap was sprung. In a quiet area of the park, away from watchful eyes, Brianna was surrounded. The attack was swift and brutal. Stab wounds delivered with shocking force for someone so young. Scarlett and her partner inflicted 28 wounds, a frenzy that spoke not of panic, but of cold determination. As Brianna collapsed, bleeding into the grass, the pair showed no mercy. The chilling part was not only the act itself, but the evidence of how much they had prepared for it. Messages exchanged before the killing read like rehearsal notes for a performance. Scarlett had written about her desire to kill, her need to feel the power of ending a life. She wasn't dragged unwillingly into violence. She was its architect. After the murder, the teenagers didn't run in chaos. They walked away, leaving Brianna's body behind. Her life ended before she had even reached adulthood. Hours later, Scarlett would return to the digital world as though nothing had happened. That casual switch from killer to ordinary teenager chatting online shocked even the most hardened detectives. The investigation moved quickly. Brianna's body was discovered in the park, sparking nationwide outrage. She was just 16, a girl described by her friends as bubbly and kind, her future full of possibilities. The brutality of her death demanded answers, and soon Scarlett and her accomplice were at the center of a police inquiry that peeled back layer after layer of chilling preparation. In court, prosecutors laid out the disturbing evidence. Scarlett had written of her desire to torture. She had spoken of killing as though it were a fantasy to be ticked off a list. Witnesses recalled her unnerving comments, her fascination with notorious murderers. The jury didn't just see a teenager, they saw someone who had embraced darkness with both hands. The defense argued she was young, immature, influenced by her accomplice, and incapable of fully grasping the consequences. But the sheer volume of evidence told another story. Scarlett wasn't a passive follower, she was central to the plan, an equal partner in a killing that stunned Britain with its cruelty. In July 2023, Scarlett Jenkinson was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years. The judge, in handing down the sentence, described the murder as carefully planned and executed, noting Scarlett's obsession with violence as a driving force. At just 15 years old, she had traded her childhood for a prison sentence that will keep her locked away well into middle age. For Brianna's family, the trial was an unending wound. They spoke of a daughter whose laughter filled their home, whose kindness defined her. They struggled with the fact that her last moments were spent at the mercy of people she believed were her friends. For them, the sentence could never balance the loss. Scarlett now sits inside a secure facility, no longer just another teenager in a school uniform, but a convicted murderer defined by a single day in February. She will grow older behind bars, her name forever linked with the calculated murder of Brianna Gay. The park where Brianna's life ended has long since returned to its stillness. Grass growing over the bloodstains, families walking their dogs past the place without knowing its history. But for those who followed the case, the image lingers. A 15-year-old girl who studied death, planned it, and carried it out, leaving another teenager's body in the mud while she walked away. Sharon Carr. In June 1992, the quiet town of Camberley in Surrey became the stage for a crime so unsettling that years later, it still stands as one of Britain's darkest reminders of how violence can live inside even the youngest of offenders. The killer wasn't a hardened adult, a shadowy predator, or a stranger lurking in the night. She was a child. Sharon Louise Carr was only 12 years old when she brutally murdered an 18-year-old stranger named Katie Ratcliffe. Katie had spent the evening out with friends, enjoying the freedom of being young, just stepping into adulthood. It was late when she left the nightclub, her night of laughter winding down as she walked home. She never reached her door. Somewhere along the way, Sharon crossed her path, and everything changed. There was no clear motive. Katie wasn't a rival or a neighbor or even someone Sharon knew. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. And for Sharon, that was enough. What followed was an attack so savage that even police officers who had worked homicide cases for decades were left shaken. Katie was stabbed dozens of times, her body discovered on the roadside, her final walk turned into a scene of unrestrained violence. At the time, investigators didn't know who could have carried out such an act. The sheer brutality suggested rage, perhaps someone with a personal vendetta. The idea that a 12-year-old schoolgirl was behind it never crossed their minds. Katie's murder remained unsolved, a wound in the community that ached without answers. Meanwhile, Sharon went back to her childhood routines, attending school, laughing with classmates, hiding the truth in plain sight. But inside, she wasn't hiding from herself. She was writing. Years later, police would uncover her notebooks, filled with graphic fantasies, confessions, and violent daydreams. Page after page revealed her fascination with killing. She described herself as powerful, unstoppable, a girl who enjoyed the idea of spilling blood. Her secret might have remained hidden, but Sharon couldn't contain herself forever. In 1994, 2 years after Katie's death, she was arrested for a separate crime, a vicious knife attack on another girl at her school. That victim survived, but the similarities were impossible to ignore. During her time in custody, Sharon's writings surfaced, and suddenly detectives saw what they had missed. The 12-year-old they had never suspected was now the prime candidate for an unsolved murder. The evidence piled up. Her notebooks contained chilling references to Katie's killing, details only the murderer would know. She wrote about the thrill, about how stabbing felt, about her desire to kill again. There was no remorse, no sense of accident, only pride. She was dubbed the Devil's Daughter by the press, a nickname that captured the shock of a nation trying to make sense of a child capable of such horror. When the case finally reached trial in 1997, Sharon was 17 years old. The courtroom heard the disturbing confessions in her own words, read aloud from the diaries where she celebrated the act as if it were an achievement. Prosecutors argued that Katie's murder was not a crime of passion, but of cold-blooded thrill-seeking. Sharon had wanted to know what it felt like to kill, and Katie had become her victim. The jury convicted her of murder, making Sharon Carr the youngest female murderer in modern British history. She was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 14 years. But as the years passed, parole boards consistently refused her release. Reports from inside prison painted a picture of a woman still considered dangerous, her fascination with violence never fully extinguished. Decades later, Sharon remains incarcerated, well past her minimum tariff. Each time her case comes up for review, officials cite the same concerns: her writings, her lack of remorse, and the risk she poses if freed. She entered prison as a teenager and has grown into adulthood behind locked doors. Her life defined not by what she could have been, but by a single night when she turned fantasy into reality. For Katie Ratcliffe's family, the passage of time has not lessened the loss. She would be in her late 40s now, perhaps with a family of her own, had her life not been stolen by a stranger with a knife. Instead, she is remembered as a victim of a murder so senseless that it still chills those who hear it for the first time. And for Sharon Carr, the name remains infamous. The girl who should have been preparing for exams, playground games, and friendships instead became a killer whose notebooks revealed a mind consumed by death. She will forever be remembered as the schoolgirl who hid her darkest truths in her diary and then lived them out on the streets of Surrey one June night. 9. Charlotte Mulhall. In Ireland, the story of the Scissor Sisters still lingers like a scar. It is not the nickname of a rock band or a dark joke. It is the title given to one of the country's most infamous family killings. At its center was Charlotte Mulhall, a 21-year-old woman who, along with her sister, carried out a murder so brutal and bizarre that it shocked even hardened Dublin detectives. The victim was not a stranger. It was her mother's boyfriend, Farah Swala, a man with a long history of abuse and violence. Noor, a Kenyan immigrant in his 40s, was known to drink heavily, lash out, and torment the Mulhall family. For Charlotte and her younger sister Linda, resentment built year after year. By 2005, it had reached a breaking point. On the night of March 20th, the family gathered in their small flat in Dublin. Alcohol flowed. Arguments escalated. Noor was in one of his rages, directing his fury toward Kathleen, the sister's mother. What happened next was the kind of moment when years of anger explode in a single act of irreversible violence. The Mulhall sisters snapped. Charlotte grabbed a kitchen knife. Linda pinned Noor down. In the chaos, Charlotte slashed and stabbed, her fury pouring out with every strike. Noor fought back, but the sisters were relentless. The killing was not quick, not clean. When it was over, Noor lay dead on the floor of the flat, his blood soaking into the carpet. But the horror did not end there. In a decision that cemented their place in Ireland's criminal history, Charlotte and Linda set about dismembering the body. They dragged Noor into the bathroom, retrieved a pair of scissors and knives, and began cutting. Piece by piece, they separated him, placing the remains into bags. Later that night, they carried the bags along the Royal Canal and dumped them in the water, hoping to erase what they had done. It was this grisly act of dismemberment that earned them their infamous title. Newspapers dubbed them the Scissor Sisters, a name that turned the case into something both macabre and unforgettable. For Dublin residents, the canal became a grim landmark. the place where fragments of Noor's body were pulled from the water in the days that followed. The investigation quickly zeroed in on the Mulhall family. Neighbors spoke of the fighting, the drinking, the violence behind their doors. Forensics tied the flat to Noor's blood, and when police questioned Charlotte, cracks appeared in her story. Eventually, the full truth emerged. The sisters had killed Noor, chopped up his body, and tried to scatter him across the city. In court, Charlotte faced the weight of her actions. The prosecution painted her as a willing, active killer, someone who had taken the lead in stabbing Noor and later mutilating his corpse. The defense tried to argue years of abuse, claiming she had been pushed to the brink by Noor's cruelty. But while the jury listened, the brutality of the crime, the sheer violence of the stabbing, the coldness of the dismemberment, spoke louder than excuses. In 2006, Charlotte Mulhall was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, Ireland's mandatory punishment for such a crime. Her sister Linda, convicted of manslaughter, received a shorter term, but would still serve over a decade behind bars. Their mother Kathleen was also later imprisoned for her role in helping clean up after the killing. Inside prison, Charlotte's notoriety only grew. She became one of Ireland's most recognizable female prisoners, her case frequently resurfacing in tabloids. Reports described her as volatile, struggling with anger, and adapting poorly to life behind bars. She has applied for release, but as of now she remains incarcerated, serving out the life sentence imposed nearly 20 years ago. For the people of Ireland, the Scissor Sisters case was never just about a murder. It was about a family imploding under the weight of abuse, alcohol, and rage. It was about daughters turning to violence in their own home. And it was about how far desperation and fury can push people when they decide the only way out is to kill. For Farah Swaleh Noor, whatever his flaws, the end was still brutal beyond measure. He died not at the hands of strangers, but in the flat where he lived with the family he controlled. For the Mulhall sisters, that night turned them from victims of circumstance into perpetrators of one of Ireland's most notorious killings. And for Charlotte, the name Scissor Sister will follow her forever, a title not of music or fame, but of blood, blades, and a canal that became Ireland's most gruesome crime scene. 10. Carol Ann Arrow, Sydney, September 1988. A 20-year-old woman named Janine Balding left work and walked toward her car in a suburban train station parking lot. She never made it home. Waiting nearby was a group of 5 teenagers, including a 15-year-old girl named Carol Ann Arrow, who would help drag Janine into one of the most horrifying gang crimes in Australian history. Janine was young, vibrant, and engaged to be married. She was living the kind of life full of promise and stability that most people her age could only dream of. For Carol, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. She was already entrenched in a world of street life, running with boys older and harder than she was, seeking belonging in the wrong places. But that September night, she crossed a line that made her name synonymous with cruelty. The gang's plan wasn't spontaneous. They were prowling, hunting for someone vulnerable. Janine, walking alone to her car, became their target. In an instant, she was surrounded, forced into her own vehicle, and driven away. What awaited her was not robbery, not intimidation, but hours of torture at the hands of 5 teenagers who treated her life as disposable. The ordeal was unimaginable. Janine was taken to a remote paddock outside the city. There, the group assaulted her, physically, sexually, and psychologically, while she begged for her life. Carol Arrow, though younger than the others, played her part in the torment. She was no bystander. Witnesses and evidence later tied her to the gang's actions, her presence helping to trap Janine in a nightmare she could not escape. The cruelty reached its climax when the group decided Janine had to die. They tied her up, gagged her, and forced her into the trunk of her own car. Then they drove her to another location, dragged her out, and drowned her in a dam. 20 years old, engaged to be married. Her life ended in the water, at the hands of 5 teenagers, with Carol among them. When Janine's body was discovered, the entire nation recoiled. The brutality shocked even veteran investigators. It wasn't just the violence, it was the senselessness. A woman's life had been destroyed for no reason other than the thrill of power and domination. Newspapers across Australia splashed the case on their front pages, labeling it one of the most sadistic murders the country had ever seen. The trial revealed the full extent of the horror. Testimony painted a picture of a gang feeding off each other's cruelty, each step escalating until Janine was dead. Carol, only 15 at the time, was described not as a frightened child swept along, but as an active participant who made her own choices that night. In 1990, Carol Ann Arrow was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, plus 25 years, one of the harshest penalties ever given to a teenage girl in Australia. The sentence reflected both the gravity of the crime and the recognition that her youth did not excuse her role. She became part of a group whose names would forever be tied to one of Australia's most infamous murders. For Janine's family, the sentence could never bring her back. Her fiancé was left grieving the woman he was supposed to marry. Her parents, devastated, spoke of the cruelty of losing a daughter who had everything ahead of her. The murder became a national conversation about youth violence, justice, and whether young offenders could truly be rehabilitated after committing crimes so horrific. Decades later, Carol remains imprisoned. While some of her co-defendants have sought parole or review, the severity of the crime continues to weigh heavily on public opinion and judicial decisions. The image of Janine, young, bright, and stolen from life so brutally, still shapes every conversation about her killers. Today, the name Carol Ann Arrow does not belong to a schoolgirl or a forgotten runaway. It belongs to one of Australia's youngest convicted murderers, a teenager who joined a pack in turning an ordinary September night into a national tragedy. Her sentence ensures she will spend most, if not all, of her life behind prison walls, remembered not for who she might have become, but for the role she played in silencing a 20-year-old woman who never got the chance to live her future. The dam where Janine's body was found has returned to stillness, but the memory of that night hasn't faded. It remains one of Australia's most haunting reminders that sometimes the monsters are not strangers lurking in shadows. They are teenagers walking together, making choices that destroy lives forever. 10 teenagers. 10 names that will forever be tied to acts of violence most of us struggle to comprehend. From bedrooms and schoolyards to parks and lonely roads, each of these cases proves that age does not always mean innocence. Some of the youngest killers in history carried out the most unforgettable crimes, leaving behind broken families, shattered communities, and questions that will never fully be answered. But here's the question I want you to reflect on. Do you believe someone who commits murder at such a young age can ever truly be rehabilitated, or should their punishment last a lifetime? Let me know what you think down below. If you found this video gripping, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others who follow true crime stories. And if you want to see more deep dives into the darkest cases from around the world, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the scariest monsters don't wait until adulthood to show their true faces.